Right away in the west of Ireland lies a tiny hamlet called Creighton. Far around it there spreads a waste of bleak and totally inhospitable country, bare and unpeopled. Yet in spite of its desolation, my friend Tonneson and I had elected to spend our vacation there. He had stumbled on the place the year previously during a walking tour and discovered the possibilities for the angler in a small, unnamed river. It was early evening when we arrived. It had taken us all day to journey the 40 miles from the railway station at Ardryan over some of the roughest tracks imaginable. Having put up our tent, we dismissed our driver, telling him to come for us at the end of a fortnight. We had brought sufficient provisions to last us, and water we could get from the stream. Tonneson had got our small oil stove lit, so I took the kettle and walked down to the river. On the way back, I passed a small group of village people. I asked them, casually, about the fishing, but instead of answering, they just stared at me. Then one of the men said something rapidly, in what I guessed to be pure Irish. It was evident that the inhabitants of these few huts in the wilderness did not know a word of English. So, with a smile and a nod, I left them, and the little crowd smiled and nodded in return, though their faces betrayed puzzlement. Next morning, we rose early and went for a swim. Then, after breakfast, we roused out our fishing tackle and strode off in the direction my friend had explored on his previous visit. During the day, we fished happily, working steadily upstream, and by evening we had one of the prettiest creels of fish that I had seen for a long while. Thus we spent several days, having splendid sport and first-rate appetites to do justice upon our prey. It was the Sunday after we arrived that we made a great discovery. Hitherto, we had always gone upstream. On that day, however, we laid aside our rods and set out for a ramble in the opposite direction. The day was warm, and we trudged along, chatting on this and that matter. And then, without any warning whatsoever, the river we had followed so confidently came to an abrupt end, vanishing into the earth. Tonneson and I stared in amazement. "Let's go on a bit," he said. "It may reappear." Presently, we came out onto the top of a high, boulder-strewn bank, from which we looked down into a wilderness of bushes and trees. From the centre of the wooded lowland there rose a great haze-like spray. "There must be a waterfall," said Tonneson. Down the sloping bank we made our way, and entered among the wilderness. The bushes were matted, and the trees overhung us, but here and there one could trace signs of a long-departed cultivation. It came to me that we were making our way through a great and ancient garden. But what a wild place it was now, so dismal and sombre. And there had grown upon our ears a distant, droning roar. Steadily the roaring grew louder and nearer, until it appeared, as I remarked to Tonneson, almost to come from under our feet. And then suddenly we came out from among the trees onto a great open space, where, not 6 paces in front of us, yawned the mouth of a tremendous chasm, from the depths of which the noise appeared to rise, along with the spray. "Good Lord," said Tonneson. I was silent, and rather awed. On the far side of the chasm there was something that looked like a fragment of a great ruin. "Come along," Tonneson shouted above the uproar. "We'll have a look at it." He started off around the edge of the crater-like abyss. As we neared this new thing, I saw that it was undoubtedly a portion of some ruined building. Yet it was not built on the edge of the chasm itself, but perched on a huge rocky spur over it. We walked out onto the projecting arm of rock, and I must confess to having felt an intolerable sense of terror as I looked down into the unknown depths below. Reaching the ruin, we clambered around it cautiously, and on the further side came across a mass of fallen stones. The ruin itself seemed to be a portion of the outer wall of some prodigious structure, it was so substantially built. Yet, where was the rest of whatever there had been? I saw that Tonneson was standing within a small excavation that he had made among the debris. He was brushing dirt from what looked like a book, much dilapidated. He handed his prize to me, telling me to put it in my satchel. This I did, first, however, running the pages through my fingers, and noting that they were filled with a neat, old-fashioned writing, which was quite legible, save one portion that was muddied and crumpled. Having put the volume away safely, I gave Tonneson a hand with the self-imposed excavating. Yet though we put in over an hour's hard work, we came up with nothing more than some fragments of broken wood. And so we went back once more to the safety of the land. We made a complete tour of the tremendous chasm, which we were able to observe was an almost perfect circle, save for where the ruin-crowned rock jutted out. To the north was a clear space, and we bent our steps in that direction. Here, distant from the mighty pit by some hundreds of yards, we came across a great lake of silent water. Silent, that is, save in one part, where there was a continuous bubbling. We were able to speak now without having to shout, and I asked Tonneson what he thought of the place. I told him that I didn't like it, and that the sooner we were out of it the better. He nodded. And then suddenly there came a strange wailing noise out of the wood on our left, and then silence. "Let's get out of here," said Tonneson, and he turned back the way we had come. He said nothing further, but kept on steadily. We were among the trees now, and I glanced round, nervously, but saw nothing. Yet I had a horrible feeling that we were not alone, and I kept so close to Tonneson that twice I kicked his heels. A minute, and then another, and then we came out at last upon the bare rockiness of the countryside. Once, as we moved away, there seemed to come again a distant sound of wailing, and I told myself that it was the wind. Yet the evening was breathless. After supper that night, I took the manuscript from my satchel. As we could not both read from it at the same time, Tonneson suggested that I should read it out loud. So there, seated in the opening of our tent, I began the strange tale of the House on the Borderland. I am an old man. I live here in this ancient house, surrounded by huge unkempt gardens. The peasantry who inhabit the wilderness beyond say that I am mad. I have nothing to do with them. I live here alone with my old sister, who is my housekeeper. I have one friend, a dog. Yes, I would sooner have old Pepper than the rest of creation together. I have decided to start a kind of diary. For a couple of centuries, this house has had a reputation, a bad one, and until I bought it, for more than 80 years, no one had lived here. I am not superstitious, but I have ceased to deny that things happen in this house, things that I cannot explain, and therefore I must needs ease my mind by writing down an account of them. Though, should my diary ever be read when I am gone, the readers will be more convinced that I was mad. This house, how ancient it is! Though its age strikes one less perhaps than its structure, little curved towers and pinnacles with outlines suggestive of leaping flames predominate, while the body of the building is in the form of a circle. I have heard that there are old stories told amongst the country people to the effect that the devil built the place. However, that is as may be. I must have been here some 10 years before I saw any real manifestations of the so-called supernatural. It was after midnight on the 21st day of January. I was reading in my study. Pepper lay sleeping near my chair. Suddenly, without warning, the flames of the 2 candles went low and then shone with a ghastly green effulgence. Down on the floor, I heard a frightened whimper as Pepper cowered under my dressing-gown. Pepper, usually as brave as a lion. And then away in the far end of the huge old-fashioned room, I became conscious of a faint glow. Steadily it grew, filling the room with gleams of quivering green light. Then they sank quickly and changed into deep, sombre crimson. The light came from the end wall. Then, as it grew duller, I was aware all at once that instead of looking at the redness, I was staring through it, and through the wall beyond. Gradually I realized that I was looking out onto a vast plain, lit with the same gloomy twilight that pervaded the room. The immensity of this plain scarcely can be conceived. In no part could I perceive its confines. Suddenly, I became conscious that I was no longer in the chair. Instead, I seemed to be hovering above it and looking down on a dim something huddled and silent. In a little while, a cold blast struck me, and I was outside in the night, floating up through the darkness. I looked to my right and left, and saw the intolerable blackness of the night pierced by remote gleams of fire. Onwards, outwards I drove. Once I glanced behind and saw the earth, a small crescent of blue light, receding away to my left. A great while seemed to pass over me, and now I could nowhere see anything. I had passed beyond the stars and plunged into blackness. I became filled with fear and despair. Where was I going? Even as the thoughts formed, there grew against the blackness that wrapped me a faint tinge of blood. Slowly, the distant redness became plainer and larger, and presently I found I was descending upon it, and soon I sank into a great sea of sullen, red-hued clouds. Slowly I emerged from these, and there below me I saw the stupendous plain that I had seen from my room in this house that stands upon the borders of the silences. Nowhere could I descry any signs of life, not even the ruins of some ancient habitation. Gradually, I found that I was being borne forward, floating across the flat waste. Yet it was a great time before I perceived any signs of the place towards which I was being conveyed. At first, I saw it far ahead, like a long hillock on the surface of the plain. But as I drew nearer, I perceived that I had been mistaken. I made out now a great chain of mountains, whose distant peaks towered up into the red gloom. And after a time, I approached a vast rift opening out into the mountains. Through this I was borne, moving at no great speed. On either side of me, huge walls of rock-like substance rose sheer. For a while, I went on steadily, and then suddenly I was at the exit of the chasm, staring out upon an enormous amphitheatre of mountains. Yet of the mountains and the grandeur of the place I recked nothing, for I was confounded with amazement to behold, at a distance of several miles, and occupying the centre of the arena, a stupendous structure, built apparently of green jade. Yet in itself, it was not the discovery of the building that had so astonished me, but the fact that in no particular, save in colour and its enormous size, did the lonely structure vary from this house in which I live. I could scarcely believe what I saw. What does it mean? The arena appeared a perfect circle, the house, as I have mentioned, standing in the centre. I glanced upwards at the slopes of the circling mountains. How silent they were. And then as I peered, a new terror came to me, for away up among the dim peaks to my right, I had descried a vast shape of blackness, giant-like. It had an enormous ass-like head with gigantic ears. But then my gaze sprang from it to something higher up among the crags. For a long minute I gazed, fearfully. The thing was black, and had 4 grotesque arms. The features showed indistinctly. Round the neck, I made out several objects. Slowly, the details came to me, and I realized coldly that they were skulls. Straight away, I knew that I was looking at a monstrous representation of Kali, the Hindu goddess of death. Other remembrances of my old student days drifted through my thoughts. My glance fell back upon the huge ass-headed thing. Simultaneously, I recognized it for the ancient Egyptian god Set, the destroyer of souls. 2 of the old gods of mythology. I tried to comprehend to what it was all pointing. Further off, reclining off a lofty edge, I made out a livid mass, irregular and ghoulish, without form, and then I saw others. There were hundreds of them. The mountains were full of strange things, beast gods and horrors so atrocious and bestial that possibility and decency deny any further attempt to describe them. And I was filled with a terrible sense of fear and repugnance. Yet in spite of this, I wondered exceedingly, was there, after all, something in the old heathen worship? But then, in the midst of my musings, something happened. Until then, I had stayed within the shadow of the exit of the great rift. Now, without volition on my part, I drifted out and began to move slowly across the arena, towards the house. All around was spread the stark loneliness of the place, and the unbroken silence. Steadily, I neared the great building. Then, all at once, something came round one of the huge buttresses of the house. It was a gigantic thing, and moved with a curious lope, going almost upright, in the manner of a man. It was quite unclothed, and had a remarkable, luminous appearance. Yet it was the face that attracted and frightened me the most. It was the face of a swine. Silently, I watched this horrible creature. It was making its way cumbrously round the building, stopping at each window to peer in and shake the bars, with which, as in this house, they were protected. Evidently, it was searching for an ingress into the house. I had now come to within less than a quarter of a mile of the great structure, and still I was compelled forward. Abruptly, the thing turned and gazed in my direction. It opened its mouth, and for the first time the stillness of that abominable place was broken by a deep, booming note. Then, immediately, I became aware that it was coming towards me, swiftly and silently. In an instant, it had covered half the distance that lay between, and still I was borne helplessly to meet it. Only 100 yards, and the brutish ferocity of the giant face numbed me with a feeling of unmitigated horror. But then, in the very moment of my despair, I became conscious that I was looking down upon the arena, from a rapidly increasing height. I was rising. Beneath me, the foul swine creature had gone down on all fours and was snuffing and rooting at the surface of the arena. A moment, and it rose to its feet, clutching upwards, with an expression of desire upon its face, such as I have never seen in this world. Continually, I mounted higher. A few minutes passed, it seemed, and I had risen above the mountains, floating alone, afar in the redness. A tremendous distance below, the arena showed dimly, with the mighty house looking no larger than a tiny spot of green. Presently, I passed over the mountains, out above the huge breadth of the plain, and then everything vanished, and only a sea of red mist was spread far below me. A while, and even this had gone, and I was wrapped in an impalpable, lightless gloom. A great time passed. Ages. And then a single star broke its way through the darkness. Presently, all about me shone the splendor of the countless stars. Later, years it seemed, I saw the sun, a clot of flame, and then I saw the earth again, blue and unbelievably minute. A long space of time came and went, and then at last I entered into the shadow of the world, plunging headlong into the dim and holy earth night. For a while, I knew nothing. I was unconscious. Then, gradually, I became aware of a faint, distant whining. I struggled madly for breath and tried to shout. I was conscious that something was licking my hand. Then things came back to me, and I called Pepper, faintly. I was answered by a joyful bark and renewed caresses. In a while I felt stronger and put out my hand for the matches. I struck a light and looked confusedly around me. All about me I saw the old familiar things, and I sat full of dazed wonder until the flame of the match burnt my fingers, and I dropped it. After a moment I struck another match, and stumbling across the room, lit the candles. As I did so, I observed that they had not burned away, but been put out. As the flames shot up, I stared about the study, yet there was nothing unusual to see. What had happened? I felt dazed and muddled. I went across to the cupboard where I keep brandy and biscuits and poured myself out a little of the stimulant. I drank it off, then taking a handful of biscuits, I returned to my chair and began to devour them ravenously. I was vaguely surprised at my hunger. As I ate, my glance fell upon the face of the clock in the corner. Therewith, I stopped eating. and just stared. The hands were pointing to a little before midnight, whereas it was, as I well knew, considerably after that time, when I had witnessed the first of the strange happenings. For a moment I was puzzled. Then, as I turned the matter over in my wearied brain, the thought flashed upon me that it was now close upon the morning of the 22nd, and that I had been unconscious to the visible world through the greater portion of the last 24 hours. During breakfast next morning, I inquired casually of my sister regarding this date, and found my surmise correct. I had indeed been absent, at least in the spirit, for nearly a day and a night. My sister asked me no question, for it was not by any means the first time that I kept to my study for a whole day, and sometimes a couple of days, when I had been particularly engrossed in my books. And so the days pass on, and I am still filled with a wonder to know the meaning of all that I saw on that memorable night. The house is, as I have said before, surrounded by wild and uncultivated gardens. Away at the back, distant some 300 yards, is a dark, deep ravine, spoken of as the pit by the peasantry. At the bottom runs a sluggish stream, overhung by trees. In passing, I must explain that this river has a subterranean origin, emerging suddenly at the east end of the ravine and disappearing as abruptly at its western extremity. It was some months after my vision, if vision it were, of the great plain, that my attention was particularly attracted to the pit. I happened one day to be walking along its southern edge, when suddenly several pieces of rock were dislodged from the face of the cliff beneath me, and fell with a sudden crash through the trees. I heard them splash in the river at the bottom, and then silence. I should not have given the incident more than a passing thought, had not Pepper at once begun to bark savagely. Feeling that there must be something in the pit, I went back to the house for a stick. When I returned, Pepper had ceased his barks, and was growling and smelling uneasily along the top. Whistling to him to follow me, I started to descend cautiously. The depth to the river must be about 150 feet. Once down, Pepper began to explore the banks. It was very dark there, due to the overhanging trees, and I moved warily, my stick ready. Thus we searched right up one side of the river without seeing anything. Then we crossed over and commenced to beat our way back through the underbrush. We had accomplished half the distance when I heard again the sound of stones falling on the other side. Seconds later, a loud, half-human, half-pig-like squeal sounded from among the trees halfway up the cliff. It was answered by a similar note from the bottom of the pit. At this, Pepper gave a short bark, and, springing across the river, disappeared into the bushes. Immediately afterwards, I heard his barks increase in depth and number, and in between there sounded a noise of confused jabbering. This ceased, as there rose a semi-human yell of agony, and then Pepper gave a howl of pain and came running out. As he reached me, I saw that he was bleeding from what appeared to be a great claw wound in his side. Seeing Pepper thus mutilated, a feeling of anger seized me, and whirling my staff, I sprang across and into the bushes. As I forced my way through, I thought I heard a sound of breathing. Next instant, I had burst into a clear space, just in time to see something, livid white in colour, disappear ahead of me. With a shout, I ran towards it, but though I struck and probed among the bushes with my stick, I neither saw nor heard anything further, and so returned to Pepper. There, after bathing his wound in the river, we retreated up the ravine and into the daylight again. On reaching the house, my sister inquired what had happened to Pepper, and I told her he had been fighting with a wild cat. I felt it would be better not to tell her how it had really happened. Though to be sure, I scarcely knew myself, but I did know that the thing I had seen was no wild cat. It was too big, and had, so far as I had observed, a skin like a hog's, only of a dead, unhealthy white colour, and it had run upright on its hind feet. To tell the truth, I felt a good deal of uneasiness as I turned the matter over in my mind. It was later that afternoon, as I sat reading, that happening to look up, I saw something peering over the window ledge, the eyes and ears only showing. "A pig, by Jove," I said, rising to my feet. But it was no pig. God alone knows what it was. It reminded me vaguely of that hideous thing in the great arena, It had a grotesquely human mouth and jaw, but no chin. The nose was prolonged into a snout. This, with the little eyes and ears, gave it a swine-like appearance. The face was of an unwholesome white colour. For perhaps a minute, I stood looking at the thing, with an ever-growing fear. The mouth kept jabbering inanely, and the eyes seemed to glow. It appeared to be supporting itself by two claw-like hands upon the window-sill. As my nerves steadied a little, I took a step towards the window. Even as I did so, the thing ducked and vanished. I rushed to the door and looked around, but only the tangled bushes and shrubs met my gaze. I ran back into the house and, getting my gun, sallied out to search through the gardens. I was determined to put an end to that swine thing. At first I searched cautiously, with the thought of Pepper's wound in my mind. But as the hours passed and not a sign of anything living showed in the lonely gardens, I became less apprehensive, plunging right through the bushes. For the rest of the afternoon, I searched. I felt that I should be unable to sleep with that bestial thing haunting the shrubberies, and yet, when evening fell, I had seen nothing. I turned homewards with a curious feeling of depression. That night, after my sister had gone to bed, I went round to all the windows and doors on the ground floor and saw that they were securely fastened. This precaution was scarcely necessary as regards the windows, all of which are strongly barred, but with the doors it was a wise thought, as not one was locked. Having secured these, I went to the kitchen, where a large fire was burning, and sat there. I dare say I had read for a couple of hours when suddenly I heard a sound. It was a noise of something rubbing and fumbling against the back door. Once the door creaked loudly, as though force was being applied to it. During those few moments I experienced an indescribable feeling of terror. My hands shook, a cold sweat broke out on me, and I shivered violently. And then the stealthy movements outside ceased. For an hour I sat there, silent and watchful. Gradually something stole on my ear, a sound that resolved itself into a faint murmur. Quickly it developed and grew into a muffled but hideous chorus of bestial shrieks. It appeared to rise from the bowels of the earth, and then it stopped. After that I just sat, and thus the daylight found me. I crept to the door to listen. For some minutes I stood there. Then, very gradually and cautiously, I drew back the bolt and, opening the door, peeped out. My caution was unneeded. Nothing was to be seen, save the grey vista of dreary, tangled bushes and trees extending to the distant plantation. With a shiver, I closed the door and made my way up to bed.